When my husband, Sam, and I first moved to the countryside, it felt like we were stepping into a dream. After years of living in the city, with its endless noise and concrete jungles, we finally found a place that seemed perfect. A little farm nestled at the edge of a quiet subdivision. The rolling fields stretched out behind our modest farmhouse, dotted with wildflowers and tall oak trees that swayed gently in the breeze. We had chickens clucking happily in their coop, goats bleating from their pen, and even a vegetable patch where tomatoes grew so juicy they tasted like sunshine itself. It was supposed to be peaceful, a refuge from the chaos of urban life. But peace? That's not what we got. Instead, we inherited Karen. Not just any Karen, the HOA President Karen. She ruled the Homeowners Association for our rural subdivision with an iron fist and an ego bigger than her oversized house down the road. At first, she seemed harmless enough, sending polite reminders about keeping our property aesthetically pleasing or making sure our mailbox matched the approved color palette. Honestly, I thought it was kind of funny. Who cared if our goat shed was painted barn red instead of beige? But then came the drones. One sunny afternoon, as I was tending to my garden, I heard a faint buzzing sound overhead. Looking up, I spotted one of those sleek quadcopters hovering above my land. Its camera lens gleamed menacingly in the sunlight. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. What on earth was this thing doing here? Was someone spying on us? My heart raced as I squinted at the drone, trying to figure out who could be controlling it. It didn't take long to guess. Over the next few days, the drone visits became more frequent. Sometimes there'd be 2 or 3 at once, zipping around like mechanical vultures. They'd hover over the chicken coop, circle the vegetable patch, and linger near the goat pen. Each time I saw one, I couldn't help but feel violated. This wasn't just annoyance, it was invasion. What exactly was Karen looking for? Did she think I was secretly building something illegal instead of planting kale? Or maybe she wanted to check if our wind chimes were visually disruptive. Sam tried to calm me down. "Ignore it," he said with a shrug. "She's probably bored." But ignoring it wasn't easy when you could hear the incessant whirring every time you stepped outside. And things only got worse when another violation notice showed up taped to our gate. This time, Karen claimed our chicken coop was disrupting the visual harmony of the neighborhood. Visual harmony. Seriously, I couldn't take it anymore. One evening, after reading that ridiculous note, I stormed across the field toward Karen's house, ready to confront her. Her driveway was lined with neatly trimmed hedges, and her front yard looked like it belonged in a magazine. When she opened the door, her smug grin made my blood boil. "You've been spying on us," I accused, pointing a finger at the drone sitting on her porch, charging like some robotic pet. She crossed her arms, completely unfazed. "I'm simply ensuring compliance with HOA regulations," she replied coolly. "If you don't want to be surveilled, perhaps you shouldn't flaunt your disregard for the rules." Her words hit me like a slap. Compliance. Disregard. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. Karen's calm, condescending tone left me seething. How could she act so smug about invading our privacy? I wanted to scream, to demand answers, or maybe even throw that violation notice right back in her face. But instead, I clenched my fists and took a deep breath. Losing my temper wouldn't solve anything. At least, not yet. That night, as Sam and I sat at the kitchen table sipping tea, I couldn't stop thinking about what Karen had said. Ensuring compliance, she called it. Like we were criminals or something. The more I replayed her words in my mind, the angrier I got. Who gave her the right to hover over our lives? Literally, with those creepy drones. This wasn't just about rules, it was about control, and I wasn't about to let her win. The next morning, I decided to do some digging. I grabbed my laptop and started researching HOA laws. Turns out there weren't many clear guidelines about using drones for surveillance. Most of the information online focused on commercial use, not nosy neighbors spying on backyard gardens. Still, It felt wrong. My gut told me this kind of behavior crossed a line, even if Karen thought she was untouchable. As the days went by, the drone sightings became almost unbearable. Every time I stepped outside, I'd hear that familiar buzzing sound. It was like living under constant watch, never knowing when one of those machines would appear overhead. Even worse, I began noticing subtle changes around the farm. The chickens seemed jumpy, clucking nervously whenever a drone flew too close. One of the goats refused to stay in its pen, probably spooked by the noise. It was maddening. Sam tried to reassure me, saying things like, "Maybe she'll get bored eventually," or "just focus on the farm." But I knew better. Karen wasn't going to stop, not unless someone made her. And honestly, I didn't want to wait around hoping she'd change her mind. Something inside me snapped. If she wanted a fight, I was ready to give her one. One afternoon, while walking through the fields, I spotted one of the drones hovering near the vegetable patch. Watching it zip back and forth made me furious all over again. Without thinking, I grabbed a rake leaning against the barn and waved it wildly in the air, trying to scare the thing away. To my surprise, it actually wobbled and moved farther off. For a brief moment, I felt a tiny spark of victory. Maybe these drones weren't invincible after all. Later that evening, I shared my idea with Sam. "What if we found a way to block their signals?" I asked excitedly. "There has to be something that can mess with their controls." He raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "You're talking about breaking the law now," he said, but I could tell he was intrigued. After hours of searching online, I stumbled across videos showing how signal jammers worked. These devices could disrupt radio frequencies, effectively grounding drones mid-flight. It sounded risky, and definitely illegal, but desperation pushed me forward. I convinced myself it was worth it. After all, wasn't Karen already breaking boundaries by spying on us? I ordered the jammer under a fake name, careful to avoid leaving any traceable evidence. When the package arrived a week later, I hid it in the barn until I figured out how to use it safely. Part of me wondered if I was being reckless, but another part, the part tired of feeling powerless, knew this was the only way to fight back. The first test came on a crisp autumn morning. As usual, a drone buzzed lazily above the pasture, circling lazily as if taunting me. Heart racing, I flipped the switch on the jammer. Within seconds, the drone wobbled in midair, then plummeted to the ground like a rock. I stared in disbelief, half expecting alarms to go off or helicopters to descend from the sky. But nothing happened. Just silence. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. "Take that, Karen." The thrill of watching that first drone crash to the ground was intoxicating. For weeks, I'd felt like a prisoner in my own home, constantly looking over my shoulder and dreading the sound of buzzing overhead. But now I had power. Real power, the kind that came from standing up to someone who thought they were untouchable. I didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I waited patiently for more drones to appear, each time flipping on the jammer with giddy anticipation. One by one, they fell, sometimes spinning wildly before crashing, other times dropping straight down like stones. Each successful takedown filled me with a strange mix of satisfaction and relief. It wasn't just about stopping Karen's spying anymore. It was about proving that she couldn't control everything, or everyone. Word spread quickly among the neighbors. At first, no one knew what was happening. People would step outside to find shattered drones lying in their yards or half buried in flower beds. Some assumed the machines had malfunctioned. Others whispered about sabotage. Either way, panic rippled through the subdivision. Drones weren't cheap, and replacing them wasn't exactly convenient. Soon enough, fewer and fewer of those buzzing intruders appeared in the skies above our farm. Sam watched all of this unfold with a mix of awe and concern. "You're really enjoying this, aren't you?" he said one evening as we sat on the porch, sipping lemonade. I grinned mischievously. What's not to enjoy? We're finally getting some peace around here. But Sam wasn't entirely convinced. He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Look, I get why you're doing this. Trust me, I do. But what happens when Karen figures out it's us? She's not going to let this slide." His words gave me pause. Deep down, I knew he was right. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. If anything, she'd double down and make life even harder for us. Still, I couldn't bring myself to feel regret. Every fallen drone felt like a small victory against her oppressive rules and constant meddling. Maybe it was reckless, but I didn't care. For once, I felt like I was fighting back instead of sitting idly by while she took away our freedom. As if on cue, Karen called an emergency meeting a few days later. Flyers appeared taped to mailboxes across the neighborhood, demanding attendance. The notice read, "Urgent HOA meeting, addressing recent drone incidents." Clearly, she meant business. The night of the meeting, tension crackled in the air. Neighbors filed into the community center, clutching broken drones or photos of damaged property. Whispers echoed through the room as people speculated about who or what was behind the attacks. Some blamed teenagers playing pranks. Others muttered about rival HOAs trying to stir up trouble. No one suspected me. Karen stood at the front of the room, red-faced and fuming. Her perfectly styled hair seemed slightly disheveled, and her usual polished demeanor was replaced with barely contained rage. "This is an act of war," she declared, slamming her fist on the table for emphasis. "Someone in this community is deliberately targeting our ability to enforce standards." Her dramatics might have been funny under different circumstances. Standards. Really? All I cared about was protecting my privacy. And apparently, so did half the neighborhood. As Karen ranted, I noticed something surprising. Not everyone looked afraid. In fact, several residents exchanged knowing glances or nodded subtly in agreement. A few even smirked when she mentioned enforcing standards. One brave soul, a retired teacher named Mr. Peterson, finally spoke up. "With all due respect, Karen," he began, his voice calm but firm, "maybe these incidents are a sign that people don't want to be monitored 24/7. Maybe it's time we reconsider how much control the HOA has over private property." The room erupted into murmurs of approval. Karen's face turned beet red. She stammered, clearly unprepared for pushback. "That's ridiculous," she snapped. "Without proper oversight, this neighborhood will fall into chaos." But her words fell flat. Even her closest allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone in feeling frustrated. Karen's reign of terror had gone too far, and the community was starting to wake up. As the meeting dragged on, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't just about me versus Karen anymore. Maybe it was about all of us taking back our lives. The fallout from the HOA meeting was immediate and electric. It wasn't just whispers anymore. People were openly talking about Karen's overreach. The once unified front of her supporters began to crack, with neighbors questioning whether her obsessive enforcement of rules was really necessary. Some even admitted they'd grown tired of living under her microscope. For weeks, I'd felt like I was fighting this battle alone, but now it seemed others were ready to join me, quietly, at least. Still, Karen wasn't about to give up without a fight. She doubled down on her accusations, determined to root out whoever was behind the drone sabotage. Flyers appeared around the neighborhood warning residents to report any suspicious activity. "Your cooperation is essential," one flyer read in bold letters, accompanied by an image of a drone crashing to the ground. It almost felt like she was trying to turn us all into informants. But here's the thing. No one trusted her enough to snitch. Instead, people started looking the other way when strange things happened. Like the time Mrs. Thompson casually mentioned seeing a mysterious figure near Karen's house late at night, or how Mr. Peterson joked about accidentally tripping over a drone charger cord. Even Sam, who had been hesitant at first, couldn't help but smirk when he heard these stories. He still worried about getting caught, but he also knew we weren't the only ones fed up with Karen's antics. Meanwhile, I kept using the jammer whenever a drone dared to show its face. Each takedown gave me a small thrill, though I made sure to stay cautious. I only used it during daylight hours, when neighbors might mistake the crashes for technical failures rather than deliberate interference. And I always waited until the coast was clear before retrieving the fallen drones and hiding them deep in the barn. They became trophies of sorts, a reminder that Karen didn't hold all the cards. Karen grew increasingly desperate. One evening, as Sam and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, we noticed a car parked at the edge of our property. Through the fading light, we could see someone peering at us through binoculars. "Is that Karen?" Sam asked, squinting. Sure enough, it was her. She sat there for nearly 20 minutes, staring intently at our farm before finally driving off. I laughed nervously. What is she doing? Planning her next move. Sam shook his head, more like losing her mind. Her behavior only got stranger after that. She started showing up unannounced, claiming she needed to inspect properties for compliance. When she arrived at our gate one morning, clipboard in hand, I greeted her with forced politeness. "Can I help you?" I asked sweetly, leaning against the fence post. She glared at me, clearly suspicious. "Just making sure everything is up to code," she said stiffly. Her eyes darted past me, scanning the yard as if searching for evidence. I resisted the urge to smirk. Let her look all she wanted. There was nothing incriminating out here. That afternoon, I decided to have a little fun. While Karen was busy snooping around another neighbor's house, I tied helium balloons to one of the crash drones and released it into the sky. From a distance, it looked like the drone was floating away, untethered and abandoned. Within minutes, Karen came storming down the road, shouting into her phone. "It's happening again. Someone call the authorities." Her panic brought me immense satisfaction, though I tried to keep a straight face as she passed by our driveway. Watching her scramble only fueled my determination. If Karen wanted a war, so be it. But this time, she wouldn't win. Things escalated further when someone anonymously posted videos of Karen's dramatic speeches online. Clips of her yelling about acts of war went viral almost instantly. Memes popped up everywhere, poking fun at her obsession with rules and drones. Local news outlets picked up the story, turning her into a laughingstock. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just dealing with disgruntled neighbors. She was facing public ridicule. Despite the mounting pressure, Karen refused to back down. She called yet another emergency meeting, insisting she had new evidence that would identify the culprit. But as the days dragged on, it became clear she had nothing concrete. All she had was anger and paranoia. And me. I stayed 2 steps ahead, knowing full well that every crash brought us closer to freedom. Karen's final attempt to regain control of the situation came in the form of what she called a stakeout. She announced it at yet another HOA meeting, her voice trembling with frustration. "We need to catch this saboteur in the act," she declared, pacing back and forth like a general planning a battle. "I'm organizing patrols around the neighborhood. Volunteers will take shifts monitoring the skies and reporting any suspicious activity." Her plan sounded ridiculous, but that didn't stop a handful of her loyal supporters from signing up. They started driving around in pairs, flashlights in hand, peering into backyards and scanning rooftops for signs of trouble. Some even brought binoculars, as if they were birdwatchers hunting for rare species instead of people fed up with drones. At first, I was nervous. What if one of them caught me using the jammer? I couldn't afford to make a mistake now, not when we were so close to breaking Karen's grip on the neighborhood. But then I realized something. Karen's stakeout wasn't just ineffective. It was making her look even more unhinged. Neighbors rolled their eyes as her volunteers roamed the streets, muttering about how ridiculous it all was. One man joked that he'd set up lawn chairs and sell popcorn to anyone who wanted to watch the spectacle. To throw her off track, I decided to lay low for a few days. No jammers, no late-night experiments, just quiet farming and minding my own business. Sam thought it was a good idea. "Let her wear herself out," he said. "The more she pushes, the crazier she'll seem." But staying idle wasn't easy. Every time I heard the faint buzz of a drone testing its luck over someone else's property, my fingers itched to reach for the jammer. Still, I reminded myself that patience was key. Karen was already losing credibility. I didn't need to give her ammunition by acting too soon. Then came the night everything changed. It was late, and I was in the barn adjusting the jammer settings when I heard voices outside. My heart skipped a beat. Peeking through the crack in the door, I saw flashlight beams sweeping across the yard. And there was Karen, flanked by two of her cronies. They looked like a group of amateur detectives, fumbling in the dark as they searched for clues. "Well, well," Karen sneered, stepping forward. Her sharp heels clicked against the wooden floorboards as she pushed open the barn door. "Looks like we found our saboteur." For a moment, I froze. The jammer sat on the workbench behind me, glowing softly in the dim light. There was no denying what it was, or why it was there. My mind raced, searching for an excuse, but Karen wasn't interested in explanations. "You've been disabling our drones," she accused, pointing a finger at me like a prosecutor in court. "This ends now." Instead of panicking, something inside me snapped. I straightened up, meeting her gaze head-on. "Yeah, it's me," I admitted, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "And you know what? You brought this on yourself. If you hadn't been invading everyone's privacy with those creepy drones, none of this would have happened." To my surprise, Karen faltered. For the first time, her mask of superiority cracked. Behind her, murmurs rippled through the small crowd gathering outside the barn. Neighbors who had once feared her now stared at her with resentment, and maybe even a hint of admiration for me. One of them stepped forward. It was Mr. Peterson, the retired teacher who'd spoken up at the last meeting. "She's got a point, Karen," he said firmly. "People are tired of being treated like prisoners in their own homes. Maybe it's time you listen to us instead of trying to control everything." Karen sputtered, clearly unprepared for this kind of rebellion. Her face turned bright red as others chimed in, agreeing with Mr. Peterson. Even some of her loyal supporters shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. In that moment, I realized something powerful. Karen's authority wasn't just crumbling. It was collapsing under the weight of her own arrogance. As the confrontation unfolded, I felt a strange sense of calm. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every neighbor who'd been silenced by fear or intimidation. And for the first time, I knew we weren't alone in standing up to her. The showdown in the barn felt like the climax of a storm that had been brewing for months. Karen stood there, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment, as neighbor after neighbor voiced their frustrations. What started as a confrontation quickly turned into an impromptu town hall meeting, except this time, no one was afraid to speak their minds. Mrs. Harper, who lived 2 houses down, was the next to step forward. She'd always been quiet, rarely saying more than a polite hello when we passed each other on the street. But now she looked Karen straight in the eye and said, "I've had enough of your rules. Last month, you fined me for planting sunflowers because they didn't match the aesthetic. Sunflowers, they're just flowers, Karen, not some crime against humanity." Others joined in, sharing stories of how Karen's micromanaging had affected them. Mr. Lewis talked about how he'd been forced to repaint his shed 3 times because none of the colors met her approval. Mrs. Alvarez tearfully recounted how Karen had threatened legal action when she put up a small statue of St. Francis in her garden, claiming it violated HOA guidelines. Each story added fuel to the fire, and soon the barn was buzzing with voices united by shared frustration. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice rising above the din. "This is chaos," she shouted, waving her arms dramatically. "Without structure, this neighborhood will fall apart." But her words fell flat. No one was buying it anymore. Even those who had once supported her began to drift away, unwilling to stand by her side as the tide turned against her. One by one, people left the barn, leaving Karen and her 2 remaining cronies standing alone in the flickering light of their flashlights. That night marked a turning point. The next morning, emails flooded the HOA's inbox from residents demanding change. Some called for Karen's immediate resignation. Others suggested dissolving the HOA altogether. The pressure became too much for her to bear. By the end of the week, Karen announced she was stepping down as president, though not without issuing a parting shot. In a hastily written email, she accused the neighborhood of being ungrateful and warned that without leadership, everything will descend into disorder. Her dramatic exit only made people laugh. Someone even framed a screenshot of her email and hung it on the bulletin board at the community center, complete with the caption, "Karen's Farewell Tour." It became a running joke, a symbol of how far we'd come since those early days of drone surveillance and endless rulebooks. With Karen gone, the HOA dissolved almost overnight. Rules that had once seemed set in stone were abandoned, replaced by a loose agreement to keep things tidy and respectful. People painted their sheds whatever color they wanted, planted whatever flowers brought them joy, and decorated their porches without fear of fines or lectures. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive, not stifled by regulation, but free to breathe. Sam and I celebrated by hosting a barbecue for the neighbors. It was the first time many of us had gathered without Karen looming over us, clipboard in hand. As we sat around the fire pit laughing and swapping stories, I realized something important. We weren't just fighting for ourselves. We were fighting for our community. And in doing so, we'd rediscovered what it meant to truly live here. Even the drones disappeared entirely. No one dared replace them after seeing what happened to the last batch. Instead, the skies above Willow Creek stayed clear, filled only with birds and the occasional breeze rustling through the trees. Life returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after such drama. Looking back, I knew I'd taken risks. Using the jammer might not have been the smartest move, but it sparked something bigger than I ever imagined. Sometimes, all it takes is one person to say enough to inspire others to do the same. And while I'll always wonder if there was another way, I can't regret standing up for what mattered most: freedom. Life on the farm settled into a rhythm I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Without Karen's drones buzzing overhead or her endless list of rules dictating every little detail, our days became quieter, simpler. The chickens clucked happily again, undisturbed by strange machines hovering above their coop. The goats wandered freely in their pen, no longer startled by mechanical intruders. Even my vegetable patch seemed to thrive more than ever, as if it too could finally breathe easy. The change wasn't just at home. It spread throughout the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once avoided each other out of fear of drawing Karen's ire now greeted one another warmly. Front porches came alive with potted plants and wind chimes, things Karen would have deemed visually disruptive. People started painting their houses bold colors: teal, mustard yellow, even lavender. And nobody batted an eye. It was like the entire community had woken up from a long sleep and decided to live life on its own terms. Sam noticed the shift too. One evening, as we sat on the porch sipping lemonade, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, this place feels different now. Lighter." I nodded, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the fields. "It does," I agreed, "like we're finally allowed to be ourselves." But it wasn't just about breaking free from Karen's control. Something deeper had changed. We'd rediscovered what it meant to trust each other. Before, fear of punishment kept everyone in line. Now, respect for shared space and kindness toward one another held us together. It wasn't perfect. There were still disagreements, of course, but they felt manageable, human. One day, while tending to the garden, I spotted Mr. Peterson walking down the lane carrying a basket of tomatoes. He waved and called out, "Thought you might want these. They're from the new vines I planted last week." "Thanks," I replied, smiling as he handed me the basket. His gesture reminded me how much relationships had healed since Karen's reign ended. Back then, people kept to themselves, too afraid to step out of line. Now, sharing produce or lending tools felt natural again. Even Mrs. Harper, who had once been so intimidated by Karen that she apologized for planting sunflowers, stopped by one afternoon with a jar of homemade jam. "Just a little something to say thank you," she said shyly, "for standing up to her when no one else would." Her words touched me deeply. I hadn't thought of myself as brave. I was just tired of being pushed around. But hearing her call it courage made me realize that sometimes bravery isn't grand gestures or heroic acts. Sometimes it's simply refusing to stay silent when someone crosses a line. As the months passed, the memory of Karen faded into the background. Occasionally, someone would joke about the drone wars or ask jokingly if I still had the jammer stashed away somewhere. Each time, I'd laugh and shake my head, letting them believe whatever story amused them most. The truth didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that we'd reclaimed our lives and our skies. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, I found myself standing in the middle of the field, looking up at the vast expanse of blue above me. Not a single drone in sight, just birds soaring gracefully, their wings catching the sunlight. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. Sam joined me a moment later, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "Feels good, doesn't it?" he asked softly. "It does," I replied, leaning into him. "Better than I ever imagined." Looking back, I knew the fight hadn't been easy. There were moments of doubt, times when I wondered if I'd gone too far or risked too much. But standing there, surrounded by the beauty of the land and the warmth of a united community, I knew it had all been worth it. Karen's drones may have fallen like flies, but something else rose in their place. Freedom. Freedom to live, to grow, and to connect without fear. And honestly, that was the greatest victory of all.